Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm a professor and technical advisor. Next slide. And what we're going to talk about is various aspects of reproduction in goats, and then basically how we can select for the level of reproduction that we need. And that's not going to be the same for everybody. And so you're going to have to think about your system, your goals, and what the ideal goat is. And with selection, the goal is to get as close to the DNA sequences as you can. With goats, I think there's going to be a lot of reasons to pull back from that. Um, we'll talk about those as we go through this. And yeah, especially in goats, I don't think it's realistic to necessarily use DNA probes to do this selection. And this photograph, depending on your goals, this is a Nigerian dwarf goat with 5 kids. And so she had 5 kids. And because of the system and because of the breeder in this situation, she was able to raise these kids. That's not going to be the situation in all management situations. And so we have to tailor what we're doing to the resources that are available and to the time and energy that's available. Next.
Let me see what is happening with I think well, okay, go ahead. The captions are not good. Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, okay, let's see if the closed captions work now. They're not catching me, I don't think.
No, let me see what's happening. But yeah, they get me, but not you. Um, are you seeing the PowerPoint presentation now?
No, I'm just seeing everybody's face.
Okay. Now,
Okay. Yes, now I can see the slides, but I'm not seeing my words.
yeah. Mhm. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, well, I'm not sure that I'm not sure that the captions are going to actually work tonight.
Yeah. Yeah, don't worry, it's okay. Thank you.
Okay, well, uh, anyway, at the DNA level, the problem with the DNA level, in my view, is that you need a huge backlog of data. And so you need a lot of performance data and you need a lot of animals and in a whole lot of situations, that is an unrealistic assumption. Basically, especially when you're starting with a small herd or a small breed, you're not going to have that backlog of data. And so that can end up misleading you if you don't use it correctly. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through this. Next. So with the DNA and statistics, and I'm a little bit of a um, outlier here, I think. But a lot of times, geneticists will use an assumption that a single genetic mechanism is responsible for everything. So they basically, all breeds are using the same genetic mechanism to get to the same end result. Whether that's conformation, meat quality, or reproduction and fertility and fecundity, all that basically that you can assume that it's only one genetic mechanism across all, and that often is not the case. And so the danger there is that depending if you have a real common breed, and then you use the DNA techniques to determine what that breed is doing. Then, if you have a different breed with a different genetic mechanism and you expose that to the same DNA probes, you actually may be overlooking something and then you may actually be driving something to extinction. Some other novel DNA solution that may be actually a good genetic solution in some situations. These are Hemba goats in South Africa, and they're extremely well adapted, and that'd be the sort of a resource where you would think that you might find unusual genetic mechanisms for the end that you're looking for, which in this case is reproduction. Next. So reproduction in general, basically those traits have low heritability. And what that means is that the genetic component, additive genetic component usually is relatively low, but we also know that breeds and lines vary in their level of reproduction. So we know that there is a genetic component, and we know that you can select for that. And we know that over time, you can actually, make that fairly uniform throughout the entire breed or throughout the entire population. So the key here is that progress might be slow, but it is possible. And when I say that, this is especially going to be true for breeds with a long history of selection. So with a long history of selection, a lot of those genes are going to be fixed in the population. Now, that's one advantage to a breed that is basically, relatively new or relatively newly standardized. In those situations, basically, you can make fairly rapid progress in a fairly few generations. So that's going to help you. Next. Now, the environment is extremely important. So one extreme is going to be range goats in the desert, or fed goats on good grass. So the upper photograph is long-legged West African goats, basically in the Sahara Desert. Now, in that situation, a doe is going to be really lucky to raise one kid. And you have to acknowledge that. You have to have the right environment, the right goat. And then in the bottom section, that's a Swiss goat in a very, very nice, lush alpine pasture. Now, the problem is when we take a goat from one environment and we put it in another environment and we expect it to produce well. This is going to be especially when we take a goat that's been well fed in a very, very easy environment, and then we put that in a harsh environment, whether that's hot and humid or hot and dry, then all of a sudden we're asking that goat to do the same trick. And basically the environment is saying, no, we can't do that. And so usually what happens is all goats are making metabolic choices. They have a finite or set amount of metabolic resource. Some of that resource is going to be used for adaptation. Some of that resource is going to be used for production. Now, if it's an easy environment, then you can put most of that towards production. If it's a harsh environment, then you are going to have to put most of that in to adaptation. And so it just depends on the environment. And the producer goals are going to differ place to place within that environment. Go ahead with the next one. So the environment is important. So basically, high performance in an easy environment may actually do not all that well in a harsh environment. And so your breeders need to choose carefully, ideally from herds that have a similar environment or similar goals to their own. So this is a feral goat from an island off of South Carolina. Alligators, humidity, parasites, that's a challenging environment. And so, basically that's going to limit what that goat can do. Next. So, and the details are extremely important. You have to decide what system you're going to have and what your goals are. So are you going to kid once a year? And that's going to be fairly easy. So, or you're going to have accelerated kidding. Are you going to kid multiple times in a year? There's different ways to do this. One of those is you can do 3 times in 2 years. Basically, what you're going to do is you're going to put the bucks in usually every 4 months for a month. And so a doe could actually kid 3 times in 2 years under that system. Now, if we transpose what's available for sheep, the star system basically takes the year of 365 days and you divide that by 5. And so that gives you 73, which is conveniently about half a gestation. And so you can actually stick the bucks in every 73 days. And you're not going to catch them all, but you're going to basically catch those does as early as you possibly can. And over 3 or 4 years, that's going to give you one extra kidding. And that's only, if that helps you, then yes, that's a really, really good system. It complicates it a little bit because you have to go through and about a month before each kidding, you're going to go ahead and examine those does, see which ones are bagging up, get those to where they can get the nutritional support they need and the management support they need. So it's an elegant system, but it requires extra input, extra, especially management. And that's not going to be realistic in all situations. Also, the the feed regimen is going to be really, really important. So is the feed going to include supplements, or are you going to be feeding grain, or is the feed going to be forages only? And then is that going to be, basically hay, or is that going to be what the goat can get out there and browse and graze? And so that's going to be an important detail because those two systems are going to be very, very different. And you're going to demand that the goat meet that, and different goats are going to meet that in different ways. This is going to influence your choice of breeds. It's going to influence um, basically the choice of a whole lot of management situations. Now, the essential piece is the ideal goat for one of these may not be the ideal goat for another one. And obviously, all goat owners are exposed to good advertising from, breeding stock producers. And you have to realize that, they have a system, and you have to then decide whether your system mirrors that system and can use those animals to good advantage, or whether your system is so different that you have to go look somewhere else. And this gets to be quite tricky because over time, um, everybody likes a big smooth goat, and I'm included. You really, really like a big smooth goat. A really, really big smooth goat that's been fed a whole lot of supplements may not work everywhere. And so you do have to be, aware that you have to be choosing your stock from places where, it works for your system. Next.
Yeah, Dr. Phil, do you want for me to put the first question for the people to answer?
Sure.
Okay, I will try to do it from here.
Yeah, can you do it there? Oh, let's see.
Yeah, okay. So the people can answer, they start answering. Yeah, they're very fast. Oh my gosh, yeah. Okay, wow, very smart. Okay, yeah. So, do you want to give some feedback?
Um, Okay, well, it is a combination of genetic and environment. And so basically, you can't ignore either one. You have to pay attention to genetics, you have to pay important information to the environment, and both of those are going to determine. So basically, what you can do is you can take the best genetic package and put it in the worst environment, and it's going to fail. Or you can take a moderate genetic uh, animal and you can put it in a really, really easy environment and it's going to actually produce fairly well. So it's that combination, and you have to figure out which one of those fits your individual system the best.
Okay, it's a good explanation about genetics environment. Uh, just let me know when to feature the second question, please.
Oh, well, Okay, you'll have to decide that.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
okay, so um,
Go ahead.
okay. Now, let's see. One aspect that's important is flushing, and flushing is a specific management practice, especially for sheep. What you're doing is you're providing something, anything that's going to cause increased weight gain before you mate the animals. And so, strangely, there's this town in New York called Flushing Meadows, and they actually used to use that area to put the sheep in because it was a really, really rich pasture about a month before they were going to put the rams in. And so that was Flushing Meadows because they would flush the ewes and then they would get more lambs. Now, this is extremely well documented in sheep. It is less well documented in goats. And so there's some evidence that it works in goats. There's some evidence that it doesn't work in goats. In my own herd, I really do think that perhaps it does work, but it's less well documented. So whether you can actually rely on this or not is open to question. Next. So one strategy, and this is going to be controversial, and it's a strategy that's used especially in New Zealand in sheep production. They're actually going to take their ewes and they're going to have them fairly thin before they're flushing them. So this would probably be a body condition score of 2. I don't think you want them at 1, but you want them, 2. So they're going to be on the thin side, and then you're going to feed concentrates, or in the situation of New Zealand, they are going to have reserved some really, really good forage. They're going to put the ewes on that a month or so before mating, and they're going to start gaining weight. The trick here is anything that's going to make them gain weight is going to do the trick. So the goal is going to have weight gain, but you don't want to have the animals overconditioned because if they're too fat, then that can be a problem for pregnancy because you can end up with more pregnancy toxemia. You can also end up with more difficult births. So fat is a problem. So when you're thinking about flushing, you really need to put all the factors together. And so you're going to need to have you're going to need to pay attention to body condition scores. You don't want them too thin, you don't want them too fat. But at the end of this whole process, after they've gained weight, you don't want them too fat. Now, the devil is in the details, as always. And so basically, for younger animals that are still growing, they're growing anyway. And so flushing isn't really going to work for them because they're already gaining weight. So this actually works for mature animals that have quit growing. Basically, then if they're thin and they're gaining weight, they're going to have a greater incidence of twins and triplets than they would have without that flushing. Hopefully that makes sense. Next. Now we'll kind of go back and we'll talk about, how many times a year you want to have kids, and basically if it's once a year, basically nearly all goats can do this. Fecundity does matter, and fecundity is basically the number of kids that a doe is going to have. So it's the same as prolificacy. Flushing might matter, um, and then also the genetic background. These are Appenzeller goats in Switzerland. Dairy goats in general, there's going to be some selection for prolificacy, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Seasonality is usually not an issue. Basically, if it's going to be once a year, you can even use breeds that only breed once a year because that's your goal. Now, if you have a dairy goat, and especially if it's one of the Swiss breeds, you're going to usually kid once a year, but you're going to try to spread that out. But the seasonality of those animals is going to be a limit beyond which you can't go. So that's, basically that's going to fix your system within certain constraints. Next. Now, if you do an accelerated schedule, this is going to reward the out of season breeders. And so this is a Nubian goat. Nubian goats routinely breed out of season. There's a whole lot of breeds that do this. Now, there's some breeds where it's going to actually vary individual to individual, whether they're going to breed out of season or not. Now, each time slot, depending on what you do, is going to bring its own challenges. Now, goats they really, really like to kid in the spring. So March, April. And so basically what that means is if you're going to breed for those March and April kids, then that is a really, really easy task for those does. And that's when you're going to get the maximum number of kids out of those does, because that's what they like to do. They don't really like it to actually be in the middle of summer or in early fall. That's off season. And so that's a real challenge. Now, what that means is each when you're targeting each one of those time slots, that's going to be a challenge to the system. And so you're not going to be able to directly compare the results from a doe that kids in March with one that kids in July, because basically they're facing different environmental challenges just in the season of the year. And so, be aware of that. So what you want to do then is if you're accelerating this, and you're having kids at different times during the year, what you can do is you can reward those in each time slot that have raised twins or triplets or more, or whatever your goals are, and so within all the ones that are kidding in July, some are going to have singles, some are going to have twins, and you can pay attention to that and you can reward those, if you want twins, so that you have, basically more twins. And then, if you want triplets, reward those that have triplets. So you need to also tailor this to the nutritional support. We already talked about that. I mean, if they have triplets and can't raise them, then it defeats the purpose of having triplets. So nutritional support is important, but also just evaluating, comparing those animals within that time slot that have raised twins, or triplets successfully, so that you can do that. Next. Now, there are some lessons from sheep in the level of fertility here. Some sheep breeds use a genetic mechanism that's additive, and the Finn and the Romanov do this. And so the upper photograph is Romanovs, and basically this is easy to use because the percentage of breeding of Finns and Romanovs in a crossbred flock is going to increase the number of lambs by about that same percentage. So it's additive, it's easy to play with, it works quite well. Now the border Leicesters, the second photograph there, are a little bit unusual because they have a genetic mechanism that actually crossbreeding brings it out so that half border Leicesters actually have quite a bit of extra lambs than you would expect. And it's a genetic mechanism that just responds to crossbreeding quite well. The single genes are quite interesting, and everybody thinks kind of off the top of your head, that would be really, really useful. And in the merinos, the Barula merino has a single gene that does this, and the Thoka of Iceland also has a single gene that does that. Now, the question is, how can we use these? Now, this is sheep, not goats, and I realize that, but the thought experiment helps you because if these things are available in goats, then how we use them is going to vary. Next. So you got to match the mechanisms of the system. So these polygenic mechanisms, yes, we can use them in a pure breeding situation. So within Finns and within Romanovs, the more the merrier, especially if they can raise them. Now we can also use that in crossbreeding because, basically we can use those as sires in crossbred flocks, and then we can save the ewe lambs, and then we're going to boost the lambing percentage in that flock. Now with heterosis, which is crossbreeding advantage, then basically there's a moderate boost in the crossbreds. This is the border Leicester example. This one's not going to work very well in pure breeding. It's going to, this relies on those animals being used in crossbreeding to bring this out to its maximum extent. Now the dominant genes, yes, you can use them in pure breeding. There's going to be a problem, and we'll talk about that. But they're good in crossbreeding. And the problem with these genes is a lot of times when they double up, so when the animal has two copies of the genes, they may have 4 or 5 or 6 lambs, and that's going to be too many for most systems. And so you want to pull that back. And so this can actually be useful in crossbreeding where all of the ewe lambs only have one copy. but that's going to be a dead end. It's going to be basically those ewe lambs are going to be useful, but they're not going to be useful to retain their lambs for breeding. They're going to be useful for breeding, and then you repeat the whole cycle. So it's sort of an interesting example of a really, really useful genetic mechanism, but it has to be managed very, very carefully, or it creates problems. So the ones with two copies of the gene may basically have too many lambs, and then you have a problem there. So, these different genetic mechanisms, sure, they're useful, but then you have to figure out how useful are they for your system. Next. Now, we're going to have to figure out how to measure this, and I kind of like low-tech solutions, and there's different ways to do this. Basically it's going to be direct from the phenotype or what the animal is showing you. And the most obvious is the number of kids at birth. Do they have one, two, three, four, five? And in different situations, you may want that. So that's going to be one. Now, if you're raising goats on pasture, or especially if you're raising meat goats, that's going to be a little bit different. You may actually want to focus on the kid number and the kid weight at weaning. Now, those of you that have been doing this for years know that a moderate set of twins is going to weigh more than a really, really good single. And so that's why the weight is important, but also the kid number. So you want the kids at birth, and that's going to be especially useful in a dairy situation if the kids are going to be raised on milk replacers or off their dams. And then that's going to be of less use if it's going to be range goat production. But this is a picture of kids that were weaned, twins, so that, yes, that doe did a good job. That's telling you some information. Next. Now, progeny testing can actually be the most accurate. So when we're talking about just the direct phenotypic measurement, there's going to be problems because the environment's going to play. Now, progeny testing, you're going to be able to figure out, like, among bucks, which buck produces the does that have the best fertility. Now that can be the most accurate. Now, unfortunately, that needs a really large data set. And those data sets ideally are going to be across different breeds. So breeds that are really, really well organized and have a number of, a relatively moderate number of people that are producing breeding bucks that can be used widely, that's going to tell you quite a bit of information. Now, this allows the breeders to target what's wanted. And especially basically at the end of this, you're going to get estimated breeding values. And for reproduction, those can actually be the number of kids expected. So that, if you use this buck, those doelings may actually have an extra tenth of a kid across a population, or an extra 2/10 of a kid across a population. Now, and those systems are actually widely available in sheep. And it allows the breeder to target exactly what you want. So if an extensive situation and a range situation, you may actually not want more kids. You may want only one or two. You may not want more. Then you can select a buck out of this system that may actually, not raise that number of kids, or actually, if you have too many, it may actually take it back down. So you can use this to select exactly what you want. Now, in intensive systems, especially if it's a dairy situation, you may actually want several more kids. So you may want to use that buck that has, the reputation or the proven genetic propensity for producing the most kids out of those doelings that he's sired. So it all depends on the system. Next. Now, fecundity is kind of a special word, and it's basically how many kids are present at each birth. Now, this gets to be important, especially in dairy goat breeding. More kids means more placentas, and the placentas actually have an influence on the subsequent lactation. And that makes sense, because basically a doe that has one doesn't need as much milk as a doe that has two, doesn't need as much milk as a doe that has three. So each one of those placentas is actually contributing to milk production. And there's a whole lot of more, there's a whole lot of other genetic influences besides this. So, but more placentas, more milk in general. So what this means over time is that dairy goats, and these are Swiss dairy goats in Switzerland, dairy goats are usually prolific. And that's a good thing because, basically the more placentas, the more milk, everybody goes away happy. And of course, since most of those kids are going to be raised not on the dam, that works pretty well. So again, system, genetic resource management, all that fits together. Next. Now, but this gets back to mothering ability. And so kind of instinctively we think, oh gosh, the more mothering ability, the better. We want the mothers to be just like the best they can be. Now, there can be such a thing as too much mothering ability. And the doe on the left here is actually one of my does. And what she would do is a day before she kidded, she would go beat up some younger doe and she would steal her kids, which they're then going to get the colostrum. So actually, too much mothering ability is a disaster. So we named this one the den mother because she would assemble as many kids as she possibly could. But in a range situation, this is not good. And so what we had to do was we would have to isolate her about a day before, 2 days before she kidded, and then she would love her own kids. She would be perfectly happy and take care of them perfectly well. But if we just put her in the herd in general and didn't pay attention, she would actually cause a problem because she had too much mothering ability. Now, too little mothering ability is also a disaster, right? So they can abandon kids, they can ignore kids. Now, dairy goats, once again, this is not intuitive. Intuitively, we think that the more milk production, the better the mother, everything's fine. A lot of dairy animals, and this is true of cattle, it's true of sheep, it's true of goats, they will very, very, very happily have all their youngsters, and then they will very, very happily walk off so that you can milk them. And when you back off and you think about this, it actually makes sense because if there's too much mothering ability, they're going to resist you taking the milk. And so basically what we're doing with a dairy situation is, and not necessarily deliberately, but effectively nonetheless, we're selecting for not very good mothering ability and high levels of prolificacy. And so, basically, yes, in a dairy situation, those can fit together very, very well. In a range goat situation, those do not fit together very, very well. So again, it goes back to the idea that you got a system, you got a goat, you need to match those up to where that works quite well. And I don't know how fast we're going. So next, and we may end up with time for discussion on some of these points. There are some easier techniques that have been proven over the time. One is scrotal circumference. And, basically, um, the bigger the testicular size, that translates into bigger ovarian size. Now, obviously, we can't get in and really measure the ovaries as easily as we can the testes, and that makes sense. So with scrotal circumference, we like to think bigger is better. At least up to a threshold. So really what this means is too small is too small. So bigger is better up to some limit, and then it's no longer better. The problem with this is going to vary breed to breed because body size is going to influence this as well. But within a given breed, body size should be about the same. And then those bucks with a larger scrotal circumference are on average going to be producing doelings that produce more kids and usually produce them earlier and usually produce them for a longer productive life. So they're going to actually produce kids with early maturity, higher fecundity or prolificacy, and a longer productive life. And so that's going to tell you something. So, this one's easy and, can actually make a difference in the generations as they come along. Next. Now, one important question is, when is it too much? The system has to have enough support for the dose to raise multiples. And so this photograph is from Patagonia in Argentina. And so basically these animals have to survive in a desert-like environment, and periodically it's covered by ash from the volcanoes. And so again, if they produce one and raise one, that's great. If they produce two and raise two, that is worth a really close look, because basically they have succeeded in that environment beyond what the rest of them have done. But again, what you're doing is you're comparing the animals within that environment with each other. And so what you're trying to do is not push it beyond what the environment can do, but up to the limit of what that environment can do. So it goes back again. No single system is best. Each is going to shape the goats in its own unique way that's going to help the producer reach the producer's goals. Next, target the goals to the environment, management, support, producer goals, all those go together. I believe that's the last slide. Now, Dr. Salinas has some questions to poll and see if there's a next slide. I don't think there is.
Well, I will go with the second question right now. So the people start answering. And you can talk a little bit about this also, because there are some difference about the responses now. And probably you can repeat a little bit
Okay.
about selection and also about crossbreeding.
Okay. Well, the poll is, basically people think it's high heritability, and it actually turns out to be low to medium, and it's probably low in most cases. And so what this means is that progress is going to be slow, and it's going to be very, very deliberate. Now, there is going to be a boost in a crossbred system, and again, that is going to vary system to system. Very, very few dairy producers are likely to be crossbreeding. The commercial ones may well do that. And in that situation, the crossbreeding can actually boost a little bit. But again, you're gonna be selecting bucks, basis on their milk production of their daughters more than you are basically on any sort of crossbreeding boost. The crossbreeding boost from the meat producing breeds is going to be interesting. The Kiko goat comes from a fairly recent crossbred origin, and so you're still probably benefiting from the heterosis, in that recent crossbreeding. In other situations, especially like within the Spanish goats, there's going to be old isolated bloodlines. You're probably going to get a bit of a boost if you actually cross even among those bloodlines. So some of those old Texas bloodlines that have been closed for decades or even a century in some cases, cross those, you're going to get a little bit of a boost. And that goes along with the low heritability too. You can boost that, especially with crossbreeding from heterosis. That's going to be mainly if you're an end producer, basically if you're a purebred producer that's interested in selling breeding stock, then that boost from crossbreeding isn't really going to be available to you, because you're going to be losing other aspects of the predictability of your own stock as it goes there. And so then you're actually going to be more interested in selecting within your stock for the higher levels of fertility.
Okay, I will go with another question. So, and the people also can put their questions in the chat. But this is the third question.
Yeah, people are getting this one right. And it's the scrotal circumference of the sire. Um, the udder capacity of the dam sounds interesting, but that doesn't really help you. The birth rank um, really doesn't help you much in the age of weaning. This one, the scrotal circumference is going to be the biggest influence on this one.
And what is the reason, Dr. Phil?
Um, well, it's related to the gonadal size, and basically that just correlates with early puberty. And so those animals are simply more fertile, more prolific, and they mature earlier. And that's actually going to be true. That's even going to be true in cattle where we don't expect twins. The bigger scrotal size, you're going to end up with the heifers that are mature earlier and do better.
So do you think it has something to do with like the quantity of hormones circulating? Think there's an influence there?
That's a really, really interesting point, and I don't know. It could well. It may well, or even if it's not one of the main reproductive hormones, it may be related to the hormones that actually trigger puberty, which may not be the steroid hormones that we usually think of when we're thinking of ovaries and testicles, which is way more answer than you were looking for. But yeah, so yes, it's complicated. Yes, it could be hormonal, but it's not probably one of the main reproductive hormones that you think of coming from the ovary or the testis.
Now, when you're calling early puberty is for males or females, for both of them, or only
Um,
for males?
no, this is actually going to correlate across both
Okay.
sexes. So it's going to correlate for females and for males.
And what is the advantage to have early puberty?
The advantage to early puberty is going to vary on the system. In my system, I I mate the does to kid as 2-year-olds, not as yearlings. If you wanted to mate, for some sheep and goats, you can mate certain breeds to go ahead and kid as yearlings, and then basically what you want there is early puberty, rapid growth, and that's the goal. But again, it's a whole system. You have to have the system that supports them nutritionally to support that. And in that situation, early puberty is going to help you because those animals are going to grow. They're going to be cycling when you want them to be cycling, and that's going to work. Now, this a cattle example may be kind of silly, but I was in Mississippi. The breeder had the local breed of cattle. They ran the bulls in with the whole herd all the time. And one of those heifers had actually calved at about 18 months old. And if you're a cow person, that is way, 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 way too early. She calved successfully. It stunted her growth forever. And then she's weaning calves that are equal to her own body weight, which is pretty amazing, and it's all related to this early puberty. And then she will probably last up into her teens, so a long reproductive life. So all these things kind of fit together if we can figure out a creative way to use them.
Mhm. Okay, I will go with the question number 4.
Okay, and with this one, in range production systems, I would go with total weight of weaned kids every time because they may have huge litters and not raise them, and that doesn't do you any good. Obviously, they're going to have milk production, but the milk production has to go towards that total weight of weaned kids, and I think that's going to help you the most.
It is kind of interesting because it's depending very much about the production system and the breed, if it's milk, is meat. Uh, uh, of a season for reproduction. So in the spring and fall breeding, yeah, it's kind of interesting. So
Okay, we're having some questions come through the chats, which is good. What is the state of data availability to target the male and female progeny percentages, herd building, selecting for duelings, meat market, selecting for males, and that one, I am no expert on sexed semen or its availability in goats. That would be the way to go. Now, there's a whole lot of traditional folk remedies for this, and you have to decide if they're accurate. Some long experienced breeders will tell you that if you mate the does once when they first come into heat, you get more doelings than bucklings. Now, I have bred goats for 30 years. I have only produced more does than buck kids 2 years. And most years I end up with about 75% buck kids, which is way off the 50-50 that you expect. Some of that may be body condition of the does. There's some evidence that the more dominant does, the more heavily body conditioned does tend to have bucks. So that, all of these things lack extensive scientific rigor, but they're out there. Other people insist that if you feed apple cider vinegar, you're going to get more does. I kind of doubt that. And of course, no matter what you feed them, eventually the does are going to adapt to it. So yes, if you're feeding apple cider vinegar, you can do it for a while. Can't do it forever because they're going to adapt and it's not going to do any good.
I'm happy to go through the questions with you, and there was a couple ahead of that, and I know it gets challenging to wiggle around through the chats, but so one that I'd like to go back to would be about body condition score at the time of breeding. Can you talk a little bit about that? This kind of was back during the flushing part of your talk. What should the body condition score be at the time of breeding?
Okay. So you should okay. In the New Zealand system, what they do is they actually take them down after the lambs are weaned. They will take the ewes down to a 2 and then get them back up to a 3 or a 4. So you can do it fairly rapidly. That's got risks, and I'm just telling you it's out there. I'm not necessarily sure this is going to be a goal for everybody. If that answers the question.
So what would you recommend the body condition score being during breeding? Would you recommend a 3, or like what are we targeting for breeding?
Probably 3 is probably ideal. Again, the issue is not necessarily the body condition score, it's whether they're gaining weight. But if they were 2s and now they're 3s, that's great. If they're 3s and now they're 4, then you got to maintain them through pregnancy, and you got to make sure that they're not going to lose weight during gestation, because then you end up with the problem of pregnancy toxemia. So targeting that, you may actually want them at 2 right before mating, and then at 3 at mating, and then you can bring them between 3 and 4 through gestation. 5 is too fat because you're going to end up with the same problem there.
So here's another question. From those who routinely give 4 to 5 kids, what is the heritability of those prolific genes on the buck kids? Are they able to pass on that prolificacy from their dams?
And I don't know the answer to that. Probably to some extent. And this is from a Nigerian goat breeder. Yes, there is probably some influence. How simple that is genetically, I can't tell you. This would actually be a situation where if there is a single gene out there, this is what it's going to look like. And this actually may be what's happening, but I don't know of the evidence if it's out there.
Gotcha. And then somebody asked about the more kids, more placentas, more milk. Does that apply to sheep as well?
Yes. And so basically, when you talk about dairy sheep, like the East Frisian, they're going to actually be among the most prolific sheep. The same deal. You're selecting for milk production, you're inadvertently selecting for prolificacy and number of placentas because that helps boost that.
Gotcha. Somebody's asking if there's actually publications out there about scrotum size. Do we have some research data on that out there somewhere?
I would have to look that up. Most of the really, really good data come from the cattle data, and then you just transpose it. But yes, that may well be out there. I don't have it.
Okay. What about productive lifespans of dams? Comparing those who are doing singles or twins regularly, or those very high producers on, 3 or 4 kids or lambs. Do we see a productive lifespan difference between the does that produce less and the does that produce more?
Anything I tell you on this one would just be anecdotal personal experience. And I've had does that kidded when they were 17 years old, and those does always had twins or triplets. And so, yeah, is that the reason? I don't know. But basically, being that productive did not decrease their ability to live a long life.
Gotcha.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. So what about crossbreeding? How does it work when we crossbreed a black-faced anything that helps with the production of more in twins over singles?
Well, I mean, basically, anytime that you have really, really narrow defined breeds and you cross them, you're going to get a boost in fertility. And so, basically, if you're crossing, blackface, I'm assuming we're talking sheep, blackface sheep.
I'm assuming so, yes.
With usually with merinos or fine-walled sheep, then you're going to get a boost there just from the hybrid vigor.
Yep. And then somebody commented that they thought in cattle, the increased scrotal circumference was an indicator of increased fertility in sires' daughters. That's weird. But yes.
Yeah. Basically, yes. The daughters of those sires have increased fertility, earlier puberty and more regular breeding, and usually a longer productive life. So yes, it's the daughters of those sires with the large scrotal circumference.
Right. And then do you have any tips on first-time kidders and not letting them abandon their kids? How can we intervene with those?
Well, it depends on how heartless you are. If it's a small farm situation, you can confine them for kidding, and then they're stuck there with the kids. Some of them can be pretty stubborn. And then, at least in my own experience, usually when they kid and then that kid makes noise, they will turn around, they will have a very, very nice low voice, and then you can rest assured that, oh, good, everything's kicked in. And sometimes if it's a difficult parturition, what I will do is I will pinch that little kid's toes until it screams. And then when it screams, mom turns around and starts to like it. So that's what you want. Now, some of them are a little bit more stubborn than that. If you can restrain them and let the kid nurse, when that milk starts coming through and into the manure, then usually that doe smells herself, and it may take a few days, which in some situations is unrealistic. And that's why I say it's system. So in a range system, you may not want that doe anyway. You may want the ones that actually accept and use their kids and better. But especially for first timers, if it's a rough kidding, that can upset things. If it's a normal kidding, usually things go better. You can intervene by restraining the doe, and usually over a day or two that helps. Some does, if they have twins, will reject one and not the other one. And some of them, it's extremely difficult to change their minds.
That's true. I found in my herds, the ones that it was difficult to change their minds, they found their way to another herd or the slaughter facility. And it was their job to raise babies, not mine.
Well, and that's completely legitimate. Now if you were a dairy goat producer,
Yep.
completely different. And then of course there's everything in between. So system, management, goals, the whole thing has to fit together.
Right. So how about a new billy? Can a new billy cause higher litter rates? Have a doe that usually has singles. The only change has been the billy. I assume she's had more than singles this time.
Yeah, but I'm afraid the only effect there is in the daughters. Um, so what the doe's going to do, the doe's going to do, and it shouldn't really. I mean, if you're using a really, really, really substandard buck, then that may be a factor. Or if you're using artificial insemination, that may be a factor. But if it's natural mating, then you're assuming that everything she ovulates is getting fertilized, and so that's on the doe, not on the buck.
Could the buck effect have something going on if we've got a particularly stinky buck compared to our previous bucks? Could that influence some ovulation things in the doe?
That might in some situations, especially earlier in the season. And again, this time I've had does that produce single, 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 single. So then I sell them, and then they turn around and have triplets. So maybe they're just spiteful. I don't know.
Could pulling or bottle feeding kids for numerous generations cause decreased maternal instinct in those lines?
Um, Not directly, but indirectly, because basically what you're doing is now you're not rewarding good maternal instinct. And so you're allowing it to play a bigger role and have more variation. So basically what you're not penalizing the poor mothers anymore when you do that. And like in a dairy situation, that makes perfect sense. In a range code situation, that doesn't make sense. So again, system, whatever you want.
Gotcha. And I think there's just one last question, and it's 5 o'clock. So about capturing and painting doe urine, I assume on the babies, to help promote mothering.
Haven't heard about that one and haven't used it, so I can't help you on that one.
I'll turn it back over to Homero.
Yeah. I think we are done. I want to stop sharing and just to say thank you so much, Dr. Phil. I think there is a lot of interest about genetics and a lot of knowledge that has been coming from cattle, from the small ruminants, and there are not many people working right now worldwide in genetics. So thank you for bringing all your experience. I know that there are a lot of questions. We are trying to put together a group of people to come during May, one day to be talking about genetics in goats, because it's the Goat Expo at Sedalia. So if you can come again, we are happy to have you, Dr. Phil. And so we are going to be talking. We are now preparing the program with the people over there in Goat Expo. And so for next December 8th, we are going to have again the reproduction. So we are going to send information and will be 4 o'clock. So any last comments, Dr. Phil?
No, I mean, there's always more questions than answers, and that's just what we're dealing with.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Yeah, but what's very interesting just to be thinking about the environments and the genetics, the genetic part. So is to say how to fix one with another is very interesting in the practical way that you explain it. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Very good. Thank you all.
Okay, well, thank you so much. See you next Monday. Thank you, Dr. Phil, Jennifer, Mohan.